The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty compound as Maria Elena Vasquez checked her watch for the third time in 5 minutes. She stood outside the military logistics office in the remote outpost of Kandahar, Afghanistan, her weathered hands clutching a folder of documents that would change the course of her life. At 42, Maria had spent the last 8 years working as a civilian contractor, coordinating supply runs and managing communications for NATO forces. Her reputation for getting things done had earned her respect among soldiers who initially questioned what a woman from El Paso, Texas, was doing in one of the world's most dangerous places. The call had come at dawn. Colonel Harrison needed her in his office immediately. Something about an emergency supply run that couldn't wait for regular convoy schedules. Maria had thrown on her dusty cargo pants and tactical vest, grabbed her ever-present thermos of coffee, and hurried across the base. She knew that emergency runs meant trouble, and trouble in Afghanistan usually meant someone's life hung in the balance. Colonel Harrison looked up as she entered his cramped office. Maps covered every inch of the walls, marked with red pins and colored strings that tracked ongoing operations across the region. The colonel's face wore the same grim expression she'd seen too many times before. Behind him stood Captain Rodriguez and Sergeant Murphy, both looking equally serious. "Maria, we've got a situation," Harrison began without preamble. "Forward operating base Delta 7 has been cut off for 3 days. Taliban forces have blocked all known supply routes, and they're running critically low on medical supplies and ammunition. We've got wounded soldiers who won't make it without immediate medical attention." Maria nodded, already mentally calculating distances and logistics. Delta 7 was a small outpost about 90 miles northeast, positioned to monitor insurgent movement along the Pakistan border. She'd coordinated several supply runs there before, always using the established road network that connected the major bases. "What's the timeline?" she asked, pulling out her notebook. Captain Rodriguez stepped forward. "We need to move tonight. Intelligence suggests the Taliban roadblocks will be reinforced tomorrow, making any breakthrough impossible for weeks." "We can't wait for air support. The weather system moving in will ground all helicopters for at least 4 days." Maria frowned. "The northern route through Ghazni should still be clear. It'll add 6 hours to the journey, but the convoy can handle it." Sergeant Murphy shook his head. "That's compromised too, ma'am. We received reports this morning that they've got the whole corridor locked down tight. RPGs, IEDs, the works." Colonel Harrison moved to the largest map on his wall, pointing to an area that looked blank compared to the detailed markings elsewhere. "There is one possibility. This region here, it's largely unmapped territory. Mountainous, difficult terrain, but potentially passable for our vehicles. The problem is we don't have reliable maps of the area. The survey teams never completed their work before being pulled out last year." Maria stared at the blank space on the map. It represented about 30 miles of unknown territory between their current position and Delta 7. 30 miles that could mean the difference between life and death for the soldiers trapped at the remote outpost. "What kind of terrain are we talking about?" she asked. "Rocky, uneven. But our intelligence suggests it's mostly passable," Rodriguez replied. "The issue isn't whether vehicles can make it through. It's finding the way. The area is riddled with canyons, dead-end valleys, and cliff faces that could trap a convoy for days. Without proper maps or GPS coordinates, a convoy could easily get lost and run out of fuel before finding their way out." Harrison fixed Maria with his steady gaze. "That's where you come in. Your grandfather was a navigator in World War II, wasn't he? Served in the Pacific?" Maria nodded slowly. Her grandfather, Roberto, had been a bombardier navigator on B-24 Liberators, flying missions over the vast Pacific Ocean, where a single degree of error could mean the difference between reaching safety and disappearing forever into endless blue water. He'd taught her celestial navigation when she was just 12 years old, showing her how to read the stars the way other people read street signs. It had started as a way to connect with family history, but Roberto had insisted she learn it properly, the old way, with sextant and star charts. "You think I can navigate 30 miles of unmapped terrain using the stars?" Maria asked. "I think you're the only person on this base who has a chance," Harrison replied. "The convoy will be carrying night vision equipment, but in unfamiliar territory, that only helps you see obstacles, not navigate around them. We need someone who can maintain a heading regardless of the immediate terrain, someone who can keep the convoy moving in the right direction even when the path seems to lead elsewhere." Maria walked to the map, studying the blank area more carefully. The terrain elevation markings around the edges suggested a complex landscape of ridges and valleys. Getting lost would be easy. Getting found again might be impossible. "How many vehicles?" she asked. "5, 2 supply trucks with the medical equipment and ammunition, 2 Humvees for protection, and 1 command vehicle, 23 people total, including yourself." Murphy consulted his clipboard. "The convoy commander will be Lieutenant Torres. Good man, but he's only been in country for 6 weeks. This would be his first time leading a convoy through hostile territory." Maria felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. 23 lives, plus the unknown number of wounded soldiers waiting at Delta 7, all depending on her ability to read the stars the way her grandfather had taught her decades ago on summer nights in the desert outside El Paso. "What equipment can you give me?" she asked. Harrison smiled for the first time that morning. "I thought you'd ask. We've got a military sextant, current nautical almanacs, and star charts for this region. The communications specialist, Corporal Davis, has been working on a backup GPS unit, but it's unreliable in mountainous terrain. You'll also have a magnetic compass, though the mineral deposits in those mountains might affect its accuracy." "When do we leave?" "Sundown. That gives you 8 hours to prepare and brief the convoy. Maria, I want you to understand something." Harrison's voice grew serious. "This isn't just about delivering supplies. If this convoy gets lost or captured, it could compromise the location of Delta 7 and put those soldiers in even greater danger. We're taking a calculated risk because the alternative is watching good people die while we wait for a safe option that might never come." Maria nodded. She'd made life-or-death decisions before, but never as the primary navigator for a military convoy heading into unmapped enemy territory. The thought both terrified and energized her. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of preparation. Maria spent 2 hours reviewing the star charts and calculating the celestial coordinates she'd need for the journey. The constellation Ursa Major would be her primary reference point, with Polaris providing her northern bearing. The moon would be in its 3rd quarter, providing some natural illumination without being so bright as to compromise their night vision equipment. She met with the convoy drivers, explaining the unique challenges they'd face. Unlike standard supply runs on established roads, this journey would require constant communication and flexibility. The lead vehicle would need to stop frequently, while Maria checked their heading and identified the best route forward. There would be no road signs, no familiar landmarks, and no backup plan if they chose the wrong path. Lieutenant Torres proved to be exactly what she hoped for in a convoy commander. Young but eager to learn, he listened carefully to her explanations and asked intelligent questions about navigation procedures. His background in geology gave him a good understanding of terrain features, which would be crucial for identifying passable routes in the darkness. "The biggest challenge will be maintaining faith in the process," Maria explained to the assembled convoy team that afternoon. "There will be times when the stars tell us to go one direction, but the immediate terrain suggests another route would be easier. We have to trust the navigation and be patient. Sometimes the longer path is the only path." Corporal Davis, their communications specialist, had managed to get the backup GPS unit partially functional. "It'll work in open terrain," he explained. "But these mountain valleys will block the satellite signals. It's better than nothing, but not by much." As the sun began to set, Maria made her final preparations. She secured the sextant in a padded case, double-checked her star charts, and synchronized her watch with the convoy's communications schedule. Her grandfather's old navigation notebook, which she'd carried with her throughout her time in Afghanistan, felt heavier than usual in her cargo pocket. The convoy assembled in the motor pool area as the last light faded from the western sky. The vehicles looked imposing in the darkness, armored, practical, and loaded with enough supplies to sustain Delta 7 for several weeks. Maria climbed into the command vehicle next to Lieutenant Torres, positioned so she could see through the windshield while having enough interior light to read her instruments. "Radio check," came Murphy's voice over the communication system. Each vehicle reported in sequence, their voices crisp and professional despite the obvious tension. "Navigation ready," Maria reported when her turn came. Colonel Harrison's voice crackled through the radio. "Convoy Alpha, you are authorized to depart. Godspeed and stay safe out there." Lieutenant Torres put the command vehicle in gear and followed the lead Humvee toward the base's northern gate. As they passed through the checkpoint, Maria caught a glimpse of the guard's face in the vehicle's headlights. The young soldier looked worried, and Maria realized he understood exactly what they were attempting. The first hour of the journey followed familiar roads. Maria used the time to fine-tune her equipment and establish communication procedures with the convoy. Every 15 minutes, she'd call for a brief halt, step out of the vehicle, and take a celestial reading to confirm their heading. The routine would become crucial once they left the known roads behind. At 21:30 hours, they reached the last mapped checkpoint, a small village that marked the end of reliable intelligence. Beyond this point lay 30 miles of unknown territory, defended by an unknown number of hostile forces, leading to a destination that might or might not be reachable by ground vehicles. Torres stopped the convoy at the village outskirts and turned to Maria. "This is it. Once we leave the road here, we're committed. Are you ready?" Maria looked up through the windshield at the star-filled sky above. Polaris hung steady and bright in the north, surrounded by the familiar constellations her grandfather had taught her to recognize. For a moment, she could almost hear his voice explaining how the stars had guided sailors and soldiers for thousands of years, how they'd never failed anyone who knew how to read them properly. She picked up the radio microphone. "All stations, this is navigation. We are departing mapped territory and beginning celestial navigation procedures. From this point forward, we follow the stars. Acknowledge." One by one, the convoy vehicles reported their understanding. Maria gave Torres a nod, and the command vehicle turned off the paved road onto what appeared to be nothing more than a goat track, leading into the darkness of the unmapped mountains. Behind them, the lights of the village faded into the distance. Ahead lay 30 miles of unknown territory, enemy forces, and the desperate soldiers of Delta 7 who were counting on a convoy guided only by the ancient wisdom of the stars. The goat track lasted exactly 12 minutes before disappearing entirely into a landscape of loose rocks and scattered boulders. Maria had been counting the time, watching the odometer and taking celestial readings every quarter hour. According to her calculations, they needed to maintain a heading of 045 degrees northeast to reach Delta 7. But the terrain seemed determined to push them in every direction except the one they needed to go. "Stop here," she called to Torres as they reached what appeared to be a junction of 3 possible routes. None of them looked particularly inviting in the green glow of their night vision equipment. Maria climbed out of the command vehicle, her boots crunching on the loose gravel. The night air was surprisingly cold at this altitude, and she pulled her jacket tighter as she unpacked her sextant. The stars blazed overhead with a clarity impossible to see near populated areas. Polaris sat exactly where it should be, unwavering and reliable, while the Big Dipper pointed the way like a cosmic arrow. She took her reading, made her calculations, and consulted the topographical notes Murphy had given her about the general terrain. The route to the left appeared to head more directly toward their destination, but her star reading suggested it would curve back toward the south within a mile or two. The center path looked treacherous, with loose rocks that could trap or damage their vehicles. The right-hand route seemed to lead away from their objective, but the stars indicated it would eventually curve back in the right direction. "Which way?" Torres asked quietly, standing beside her as she studied her charts. "Right," Maria said, though her voice betrayed some uncertainty. "I know it doesn't look right, but the terrain elevation suggests that left path becomes a dead end. The center route is too dangerous for our vehicles. We go right and trust the navigation." Torres relayed her decision to the convoy. She could hear doubt in some of the acknowledgments, particularly from the truck drivers who would bear the brunt of any vehicle damage from poor route selection. But they followed her guidance, turning right onto a path that seemed to lead them away from their destination. For the next hour, Maria's prediction proved correct. The right-hand route curved gradually northward, following a valley between two ridgelines that provided excellent concealment from observation. The going was slow, rarely more than 15 miles per hour. But the convoy made steady progress. Maria's confidence grew with each successful navigation check. Then everything went wrong at once. The lead Humvee's engine began making an ominous grinding noise, forcing them to halt for mechanical inspection. While Sergeant Chen worked to diagnose the problem, Maria climbed to a nearby ridge to take another celestial reading and scout the route ahead. What she saw through her binoculars made her blood run cold. 3 miles ahead, the valley they'd been following opened into a broad plain, crossed by what appeared to be a well-traveled road. Even in the darkness, she could make out tire tracks and the disturbed earth that suggested recent heavy vehicle traffic. It could only mean one thing. They were approaching a Taliban supply route. Maria scrambled back down to the convoy, where Torres was consulting with Chen about the engine problem. "We've got a bigger issue than mechanical trouble," she announced. "There's what looks like a major enemy supply route about 3 miles ahead. We can't go through there." Torres studied his map, though Maria knew it wouldn't show any details for this area. "Alternative routes? We'll have to backtrack about 2 miles and try to find a way around to the north. It'll add at least 3 hours to our journey, and we're already behind schedule." Maria consulted her watch. They'd been traveling for 4 hours and covered less than half the distance to Delta 7. Chen closed the Humvee's hood with a metallic clang. "Engine's running rough, but it should hold together if we don't push it too hard. Lost some coolant from a loose hose connection, but I've tightened it up." The convoy slowly reversed course, with Maria directing Torres back to a point where she'd noticed a possible northern route during their earlier passage. The new path proved even more challenging than their original route, climbing steadily through terrain that seemed designed to test every component of their vehicles. 2 hours later, they encountered their first real crisis. The convoy had been climbing a narrow track between 2 steep ridges when the radio crackled with an urgent transmission from the rear guard. "Contact rear! We've got vehicle movement about half a mile behind us. Looks like 3 or 4 vehicles following our trail." Maria felt her stomach drop. Being followed in unmapped territory was potentially catastrophic. They couldn't outrun pursuit in their heavily loaded vehicles, and they couldn't fight effectively while trying to maintain their course to Delta 7. Torres immediately called for the convoy to find defensive positions. The vehicles pulled into a rough circle in a small clearing, with the supply trucks in the center and the armed Humvees facing outward. Maria grabbed her radio and contacted the base. "Base, this is Convoy Alpha. We have pursuit from unknown vehicles. Estimate 3 to 4 hostiles. Request immediate support." Colonel Harrison's voice came back tense but controlled. "Alpha, no air support available due to weather conditions. You are authorized to defend yourselves, but avoid prolonged engagement if possible. Your priority remains reaching Delta 7. "Understood, base." For 20 minutes, The convoy waited in defensive positions, while the mysterious vehicles seemed to circle them at a distance. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, the pursuers vanished. Corporal Davis, monitoring radio frequencies, picked up fragmentary transmissions in what sounded like Pashto, but nothing he could translate clearly. "They're probably trying to figure out what we're doing here," Torres said grimly. "This area might be outside their normal operational zone, too. Could work in our favor if they decide we're too much trouble." Maria hoped he was right, but she knew their situation had become much more precarious. Word of their presence would spread, and other hostile forces might be vectoring toward their location. They needed to move fast and unpredictably. "New plan," she announced. "Instead of trying to circle around that supply route, we go directly over this ridgeline. It's steeper and more difficult, but it should get us out of this area faster." Torres looked skeptical. "Can the vehicles handle it?" "Only one way to find out. The alternative is staying here until daylight, which means we'll definitely be caught." The ascent proved to be the most challenging driving any of them had ever attempted. The convoy moved at walking pace, with drivers constantly maneuvering around boulders and across loose scree that threatened to send vehicles sliding backward down the mountainside. Maria walked ahead of the lead vehicle with a flashlight, marking the safest path and warning of obstacles the drivers couldn't see with their night vision equipment. 3 hours later, they finally reached the ridge crest. Maria's celestial navigation put them about 8 miles from Delta 7, but the most difficult terrain still lay ahead. The far side of the ridge dropped into a complex maze of canyons and dry riverbeds that offered dozens of possible routes, but only a few that would actually lead to their destination. Dawn was less than 2 hours away, and traveling in daylight would expose them to observation from aircraft or distant hilltop positions. They needed to reach Delta 7 soon, or find a secure location to hide until the following night. Maria studied her star charts one final time before the approaching dawn made celestial navigation impossible. Her calculations suggested they needed to descend into the canyon system and follow what appeared to be a dry riverbed running northeast. It would require precise navigation to avoid the numerous side canyons that could trap them in dead ends. "This is our last chance to use the stars," she told Torres. "Once we get down into those canyons, we'll be navigating by compass and terrain features. If we choose the wrong canyon, we could be stuck down there for hours trying to find our way out." The descent proved even more treacherous than the ascent. The convoy moved in single file, with long gaps between vehicles to prevent a single accident from blocking the entire route. Maria continued walking point, using her flashlight to mark safe passage through the treacherous terrain. Halfway down the mountainside, disaster almost struck when the second supply truck hit a patch of loose rock and began sliding sideways toward a steep drop-off. Quick thinking by the driver and assistance from one of the Humvees using a tow cable prevented what could have been a catastrophic loss of vehicles and supplies. By the time they reached the canyon floor, the eastern sky was beginning to show the first hints of dawn. Maria's watch showed 0530 hours. They'd been traveling for almost 9 hours and covered perhaps 25 miles through some of the most difficult terrain imaginable. The dry riverbed proved to be an excellent route for their vehicles, with packed earth that provided good traction and clear passage between the canyon walls. Maria relied now on her compass and her understanding of terrain features, using the gradually lightening sky to identify the general direction they needed to travel. As full daylight arrived, she began to recognize landmarks from previous supply runs to Delta 7. A distinctive rock formation that looked like a sleeping giant, a series of switchback trails carved into the canyon walls by decades of foot traffic, and finally, the communication antenna that marked Forward Operating Base Delta 7. "There," Maria pointed through the command vehicle's windshield. 2 miles ahead on that ridgeline, Delta 7. The convoy emerged from the canyon system just as the sun crested the eastern mountains, painting the landscape in shades of gold and red. After 37 miles of unmapped terrain, guided only by the stars and Maria's navigation skills, they had successfully reached their destination. The soldiers at Delta 7 looked stunned as the convoy rolled through their perimeter. Several of them had clearly given up hope of receiving supplies anytime soon. Maria watched through the windshield as medics rushed to unload medical supplies while ammunition specialists began distributing the desperately needed rounds for the base's defensive weapons. "Convoy Alpha, this is Delta 7 Actual," came the voice of Major Patterson, the base commander, over the radio. "I don't know how you got through, but you just saved a lot of lives. We had 2 soldiers who wouldn't have made it another day without those medical supplies." Maria slumped back in her seat, suddenly feeling the exhaustion that adrenaline had been holding at bay. Her grandfather's navigation techniques, learned decades ago in the peaceful desert of Texas, had successfully guided 23 people through 30 miles of hostile territory in one of the most dangerous places on Earth. Torres turned to her with a tired smile. "Outstanding work, Maria. I've never seen navigation like that." "My grandfather would be proud," she replied, thinking of the old bombardier who had taught her that the stars never lied, never failed, and never forgot their ancient duty to guide travelers safely home. The celebration at Forward Operating Base Delta 7 was brief but heartfelt. Major Patterson personally thanked each member of the convoy, but he spent the longest time with Maria, asking detailed questions about her navigation methods and the route they'd taken. The base's intelligence officer, Captain Williams, took extensive notes about the terrain features they'd observed, the location of the Taliban supply route, and the timing of their mysterious pursuers. "This information is invaluable," Williams explained as Maria sketched out their route on his map. "We've been operating blind in this sector for months. Your convoy just provided us with the first reliable intelligence about enemy movement patterns and terrain accessibility in that entire region. While the medical teams worked to stabilize the wounded soldiers who had been waiting for critical supplies, Maria found herself surrounded by Delta 7's personnel, all eager to hear about the journey. Many of them were young soldiers on their first deployment, and the story of navigation by starlight seemed almost mythical to them. "You really use the stars?" asked Private Jackson, a radio operator who couldn't have been more than 19 years old. "Like actually looked at the sky and figured out which way to go?" "It's not magic," Maria explained patiently. "It's mathematics and observation, the same principles sailors and pilots have used for centuries. The stars move in predictable patterns. If you know how to read them, they're more reliable than any GPS system ever built." Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, Delta 7's senior NCO, had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and understood the significance of what the convoy had accomplished. "Ma'am, I've seen a lot of supply runs get turned back by roadblocks and ambushes. Never seen anyone try to navigate cross-country through unmapped terrain at night. That took some serious courage." Maria shook her head. "It wasn't courage, it was necessity. Those soldiers at the base were counting on us, and you were counting on these supplies. Sometimes you don't get to choose the easy option." Major Patterson approached with a steaming cup of coffee and a satellite phone. "I just finished talking to Colonel Harrison. He wants to debrief you personally when you get back, and he's already talking about expanding the use of celestial navigation for future operations. He also mentioned something about recommendations for commendation." Maria accepted the coffee gratefully, savoring the familiar warmth. "Any word on the return journey? I'm assuming the roads are still blocked." "That's what I wanted to discuss with you," Patterson replied. "Intelligence suggests the Taliban roadblocks have actually been reinforced since yesterday. They're clearly expecting us to try the same routes again. However, your route through the unmapped territory might now be compromised, too, since those vehicles that followed you probably reported your position." Torres joined their conversation, looking concerned. "So what are our options?" Patterson spread a larger map on a nearby table. "Captain Williams has been working on this. Based on your observations about terrain and the enemy supply route you avoided, he thinks there might be a southern approach that could work. It would add about 15 miles to the journey, but it avoids both the roadblocks and the area where you encountered pursuit. Maria studied the proposed route. It would require even more complex navigation, including passage through what appeared to be a series of narrow valleys that could easily become dead-end traps. The timing would be critical. They'd need to start the return journey before sunset to allow maximum navigation time in darkness. "I'll need to recalculate the celestial coordinates for a southern approach," she said. "And we should consider splitting the convoy. The supply trucks have delivered their cargo, so they're not essential for the return journey. A smaller convoy would be faster and less detectable." Major Patterson nodded. "That makes sense. We can provide security for the empty supply trucks to wait here until the roads reopen. The question is whether you're willing to attempt another cross-country navigation mission." Maria looked around at the faces surrounding her. Young soldiers who had been on the edge of a medical crisis just hours earlier, now healthy and hopeful because of the supplies the convoy had delivered. The decision wasn't difficult. "We leave at sunset," she announced. The afternoon passed quickly as Maria recalculated navigation coordinates for the southern route and briefed the reduced convoy on the new challenges they would face. The return journey would include only the command vehicle, 2 Humvees for security, and 12 personnel total. Lighter and more maneuverable, they would have a better chance of avoiding detection while moving through enemy territory. Corporal Davis had managed to improve the reliability of their backup GPS unit by cannibalizing parts from Delta 7's communication equipment. "It still won't work in the deep valleys," he warned, "but it might give us confirmation when we're in open terrain." As the sun began to set behind the western mountains, Maria made her final preparations. The star charts for the southern route showed different constellation patterns, requiring her to rely more heavily on Polaris and the position of the moon, which would be fuller than during their original journey. More light would help with terrain visibility, but could also make them more detectable to enemy observers. Major Patterson walked with her to the convoy assembly area. "I've been in this business for 15 years, he said quietly, "and I've never seen anything like what you pulled off last night. Command is going to want you to train other navigators in these techniques." "I hope that won't be necessary," Maria replied. "I'd rather see the roads reopened and normal supply procedures restored." In a perfect world, yes. But this isn't a perfect world, and sometimes perfect storms require imperfect solutions. Your grandfather's navigation skills might become essential for operations in other remote areas where GPS isn't reliable and roads don't exist. The return convoy departed Delta 7 at 1900 hours, just as the first stars became visible in the darkening sky. Maria had plotted a course that would take them through a series of interconnected valleys running generally southwest, eventually connecting with a known road about 40 miles from their home base. The southern route proved to be everything she had expected and more. The terrain was less mountainous than their northern approach, but more complex, with numerous side valleys and ridge systems that could easily confuse navigation. Maria found herself stopping every 10 minutes to take celestial readings and confirm their heading. 3 hours into the journey, they encountered their first major obstacle. The valley they'd been following suddenly narrowed into what appeared to be a dead-end box canyon. In daylight, they might have spotted alternative routes, but in darkness, their options seemed limited to either retracing their steps for several miles or attempting to climb out of the valley on foot to scout for alternative passages. "Hold here," Maria told Torres, grabbing her night vision equipment and a handheld radio. "I'm going to climb up to that ridge and see if there's a way through." The climb took 40 minutes and tested her physical conditioning, but from the ridge crest, Maria could see that their apparent dead end was actually an optical illusion. The valley made a sharp turn to the left just beyond their current position, hidden by a rocky outcropping that blocked their view from ground level. Convoy Alpha, this is navigation, she radioed. Continue forward 200 meters and look for a left turn. The passage is there, just not visible from your current position. The convoy successfully navigated through the hidden turn and continued southwest through terrain that gradually became more familiar to Maria. She began to recognize rock formations and ridge patterns from previous supply runs in the region, though they were approaching from an entirely different direction. Dawn was still 3 hours away when they emerged from the valley system onto a plateau that offered excellent views of the surrounding countryside. Maria immediately recognized their location. They were less than 10 miles from home base and well clear of the known roadblock positions. "Navigation to base," she called on the radio. "Convoy Alpha is approaching friendly territory. ETA to base is 1 hour. Colonel Harrison's voice came back immediately, suggesting he'd been monitoring their frequency throughout the night. "Outstanding, Alpha. We've been tracking your progress through communication checks. Medical teams are standing by and the debrief team is ready whenever you arrive." The final approach to their home base felt almost anticlimactic after the challenges of cross-country navigation through enemy territory. The familiar sight of the perimeter lights and guard towers was more welcome than Maria had expected. As they passed through the main gate, she realized she had been holding her breath without knowing it. The debrief session lasted 4 hours and involved representatives from intelligence, operations, logistics, and training commands. Maria found herself drawing detailed maps from memory, explaining navigation techniques, and answering technical questions about celestial positioning that she hadn't thought about in years. "The implications go far beyond this single mission," explained Lieutenant Colonel Santos from Regional Command. "We're operating in areas where traditional navigation methods are increasingly unreliable. GPS jamming, road destruction, and communication interference are becoming standard enemy tactics. Your demonstration that celestial navigation can provide reliable positioning in any weather, in any terrain, and without electronic support makes it strategically valuable." Within a week, Maria found herself assigned to a new position as Chief Navigation Instructor for Unconventional Warfare Operations. Her office was moved to a larger space where she could display star charts, terrain maps, and navigation equipment. Requests for navigation training came from special operations units, long-range reconnaissance teams, and logistics planners working in remote areas across the theater. The first formal celestial navigation course began 2 months later with 12 students, all experienced soldiers and contractors who needed reliable navigation skills for missions in areas where conventional methods might fail. Maria adapted her grandfather's teaching methods for military applications, emphasizing the mathematical precision and observational discipline required for accuracy under combat conditions. 6 months after the original Delta 7 mission, Maria received notification that she had been awarded the Department of Defense Medal for Valor, specifically recognizing her role in demonstrating exceptional courage and skill in navigating a military convoy through hostile territory using traditional celestial navigation methods, thereby saving multiple lives and establishing new tactical capabilities for unconventional operations. The award ceremony was held at the same base where she had started her navigation career. Colonel Harrison, now promoted to Brigadier General, presented the medal in front of an audience that included many of the soldiers from the original convoy mission. "Sometimes the oldest solutions prove to be the most reliable," Harrison said during his presentation speech. "Specialist Vasquez demonstrated that human skill, determination, and traditional knowledge could overcome technological limitations and enemy action. Her navigation of the convoy to Delta 7 has been studied by military academies and has influenced tactical doctrine for operations in contested environments worldwide." After the ceremony, Maria stood outside the same logistics office where she had received the original mission briefing almost a year earlier. The maps on the walls now included detailed annotations of the routes she had pioneered, marked as established alternative supply corridors for future operations. What had begun as an emergency improvisation had evolved into standard tactical procedure. Private Jackson, the young radio operator from Delta 7, approached her after the ceremony. He was now Corporal Jackson and had volunteered for her advanced navigation course. "Ma'am, I just wanted to thank you again for that night," he said. "Not just for getting the supplies through, but for showing us that when everything else fails, there's always another way. My platoon has been in 3 situations since then where GPS didn't work and radios were jammed, but we could still navigate because you taught us to read the stars." Maria smiled, thinking of her grandfather Roberto and the summer nights when he had patiently taught a 12-year-old girl to find direction in the endless patterns of stars overhead. He had insisted that she learn the old ways, not because they were better than new technology, but because they were reliable when everything else failed. "The stars don't lie," she replied, repeating Roberto's favorite phrase. "They don't break down, they can't be jammed, and they're the same from anywhere on Earth. As long as you can see the sky, you can find your way home." That evening, Maria walked out to the perimeter of the base and looked up at the same stars that had guided her convoy through 30 miles of unmapped territory. Polaris hung steady in its eternal position, surrounded by the familiar constellations that had guided travelers for thousands of years before GPS satellites and electronic navigation systems existed. Tomorrow, she would begin training another group of soldiers in celestial navigation techniques. Some of them would eventually find themselves in situations where traditional methods failed, and their lives depended on their ability to read the ancient wisdom written in starlight. When that moment came, they would be ready, carrying forward a navigation tradition that stretched back through her grandfather, through countless sailors and soldiers before him, all the way to the first human beings who looked up at the night sky and realized that the stars could show them the way home. The military had given her a medal for valor, but Maria knew the real recognition belonged to Roberto Vasquez, the bombardier navigator who had insisted on teaching his granddaughter skills that seemed obsolete in the age of electronic navigation. His wisdom had saved 23 lives on a dark night in Afghanistan and had established navigation techniques that would protect countless others in future missions when technology failed and only the stars remained reliable. As she walked back toward the base, Maria could almost hear her grandfather's voice in the desert wind, reminding her that some knowledge was too important to be forgotten, too valuable to be replaced by convenience, and too essential to be lost to the passage of time. The stars had guided her convoy home, just as they had guided him across the vast Pacific 70 years earlier, proving that some truths were truly universal and eternal.